widespread anger and violence to several cities in the United States and global outrage. A United Kingdom-based editor wrote an opinion piece titled, "The Case Against Civility, Who is Your Niceness Really Helping?" The editor asserts that only equals can become friends. We've invited her for an interview. Eliza Anyangwe is the managing editor of the correspondent Unbreaking News. She joins us now via Zoom. A very good morning to you from South Africa. I know we're like an hour's difference, so it's probably still morning where you are as well. Thank you so much for making the time.
You're more than welcome. Thank you for having me on.
Eliza, I'm going to go into our conversation, but just for perspective, you are an African living in the UK, and your parents, I don't know if they're still based in South Africa as academics, and you've had a fair share of having to, the ability to assess racial and racism issues globally. Tell us about your experiences that have brought you to where you are now writing about this conversation.
Yeah, so I'm definitely writing about this from a position of privilege in that my father is an academic. My mother worked for the United Nations. They've both retired now in South Africa. I was born in Cameroon. And so I grew up across the African continent, always secure in the knowledge that I was from Africa, but always exposed to people from everywhere else. And so to be confronted with the idea that the color of my skin is no reflection on my intellect or the ways in which I take up space when I moved to Europe, that became something that I had to engage with. But it's also something I engage with differently to people who are of African descent, but born in the UK, for example, or indeed my African-American brothers and sisters who are several generations removed from the continent. So witnessing how essentially on the surface there is no difference to us because I could equally be Sandra Bland. That was what spurred me to write the article I wrote, because I understand what it means to be inside, but also to see and have experienced what it means to be outside.
You reckon black people are expected to play nice when confronted with racism, and this is a tool by which individuals or institutions stifle dissent, the very dissent required for change. What do you mean?
Yeah, so by that I feel that I'm saying that black people, and this too can be applied to any group that is oppressed, is that the person who has power, particularly if they are pushing a narrative of progressiveness or being a liberal, they say, oh, yes, I have no problem with you demanding change. I have no problem with you asking for your rights. You know, I support you, but please don't do so in a way that makes me feel uncomfortable. Please don't do so in a way that will interrupt my brunch or my ability to get from point A to point B. But of course, change is never willfully given. It is inconvenient, and the people who bear that inconvenience most are the people who are oppressed. And so for those of us who are in a position of privilege, we need to either get on board or stand quietly aside, but recognize that dissent is absolutely critical for change. And usually when change is achieved, it wins things for all of us. Once trans people have dissented, whatever changes they achieve, we all benefit from. Once African Americans dissented in the form of the Black Panther movement, many of the things that they asked for and instituted, such as free school meals, etc., have now been co-opted and a part of the state, and we all Americans benefit from them. So we have to recognize that the people who are most marginalized see things that the rest of us don't see, and they often have to be forceful to get a seat at the table. And so we either champion and celebrate and stand with them, or we stand aside but let them do what is absolutely necessary to shake up the status quo.
Eliza, the George Floyd story, George Floyd is just a symbol, really, but it's something that occurs all over the world. Tell us about the UK. How is the UK engaging with events in the US, and what's the situation like for black people in that country?
Yeah, so it's important that I just clarify that to take up the job as managing editor of the correspondent.com, I recently moved to Amsterdam, where our newsroom is based. But up until June of last year, I was indeed in the UK, and I'm a British citizen and was there for almost 2 decades beforehand. And of course, I
You can
continue
give
to
us the
follow the
Amsterdam
events there.
perspective as well.
Okay, well, I'll do so. There's quite a big difference, of course, because the United Kingdom has, which they exported all over the world, a very instituted class system. So, of course, you have the double bind of being black and working class in the UK, and there is really a very tense sense at the moment that across Europe, white Europeans discount their history. I've seen so many people say on Twitter, oh, what's happening in America is dreadful. Europe isn't like this. But of course, the people who are now white Americans were first Europeans. The systems that have been set up that show that Black Brits, for example, are dying in the highest numbers from the coronavirus, all those is evidence of marginalization. And so there is a real move. Yesterday, there was a march in the UK. Today, there is going to be a march here in Amsterdam of people showing solidarity, because we know that the police do not behave in the same way as they do in the US. But absolutely, the same structures of marginalization exist, the same systems of oppression exist. We just have a culture here that means that it looks on the surface far more equal, but systemic racism absolutely continues to exist.
You say, let's imagine you have your foot on my neck. To ask you nicely to consider removing it is not going to help. What prompted you to write this piece?
When I wrote this piece in November last year, and when I read it back, I felt a chill because, of course, with George Floyd, that was exactly what had happened. Someone put his knee and his entire body weight on the neck of a man until that man died. And I was prompted to write that because I was at the time thinking of the most forceful imagery I could of an imbalance of power. So the idea that whether it is here in the Netherlands, people saying, hey, Zwarte Piet, which is a racist caricature that comes out every year around Christmas, or in the UK, whatever system of oppression there is there, or in South Africa, and people saying, I need this to stop. I'm suffering. My children are suffering. And you're saying, oh, yes, I hear you, but you do not change or challenge that foot on my neck. That was really the imagery I was trying to convey, that actually there is a power imbalance, and until we address the power imbalance, you and I cannot have a conversation, a civil conversation. You either remove your foot or I force you to remove your foot. And that isn't something that I say lightly, sat in my Amsterdam apartment, but it's something that I understand, because if you are not going to remove your foot, after a little while, you will either snuff my life from me, or I have to do something drastic to liberate myself.
Eliza, thank you so much for making the time to talk to us this morning. We're going to have to end it there. Eliza Anyangwe is the managing editor of the correspondent Unbreaking News. And she was talking to us there about race relations. Let's get to the top of the hour.